Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, legacies are not for display, they are to be lived up to. India has lived in the glory as well as in the shadow of a rich historical legacy, often to the point of nostalgia. Yet, I express my gratitude at all those marvelous talks on our journey as a nation and especially in the maritime domain. At this point, I have great honor in introducing and inviting Professor Varun Sani, currently the Vice Chancellor of Goa University. He is a professor of international politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and currently on deputation leave. He has written more than 105 articles on nuclear deterrence issues, regional security, emerging balances in Asia Pacific, evolving security concepts, emerging powers, international relation theory, Latin American issues, and is a maritime scholar well qualified to deliver the valedictory address. Professor Varun Sani, the screen is fully yours.
And Jai Hind. I am delighted to be a part of this symposium on Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, through which the Indian Navy is commemorating the 75th year of India's independence. And I'm truly grateful to the director of the Maritime History Society and to the Flag Officer commanding Maharashtra Naval Area for their kind invitation. This symposium has seen some fine presentations on the historical role of sea power and India's maritime domain. We have had presentations looking at India's naval history, the role of the Indian Navy in the freedom struggle, but also subsequently the role that the Navy has played in independent India, particularly in the successful and courageous prosecution of India's wars. What I thought was that, as the valedictory address in this symposium, I should focus not so much on history, but on the future. Because one of the ideas behind Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav is to think about India in the 100th year of our independence, namely India in 2047. So I would say if we were to look at this whole question of the Indian Navy in the role of sea power, the maritime domain, I think one of the key questions that faces us that we need to focus on is how to increase the maritime consciousness in our society. Because this is one of the key issues that is seen by scholars and analysts as an impediment to a full growth of our destiny as a maritime nation. And what I would like to do is, therefore, try to explain briefly what I think makes the maritime domain special. And I would like to anchor this talk around four concepts: the concept of global commons, secondly, the concept of public goods, third, the concept of sovereign territoriality, and finally, the concept of space and place. Each of these are sort of fairly complex concepts, but I'm going to try to sort of address them as simply as possible. What are global commons, first of all? Global commons are those resource domains or areas that lie outside the political reach of any and all nation states. Therefore, these are considered as natural assets outside national jurisdiction, the so-called common pool resources, the common heritage of mankind. And the high seas, the free sea for everyone, the doctrine of mare liberum, the open access doctrine, this is fundamental to the whole notion of global commons. And we are thinking here about the ecosystems, biomes, and processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the planetary system and systems. And contemporary international law itself recognizes four such global commons. Outer space is one, for which we have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Antarctica is another such category of global common. We have the Antarctic Treaty System, 1961, subsequent treaties in 1972, 1980, and 1991. The third such global common is the atmosphere, but on the atmosphere, there is no single treaty still. We have the 1979 Convention, the 1985 Vienna Convention, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, and the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. And finally, the domain that is of most relevance to this talk and to what we are focusing on are the high seas. And out there in the maritime domain, we have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which was negotiated between 1973 and finally signed in 1982. absolutely key international convention. What is it about the commons, global commons or commons in particular, that make them relevant? The problem with the commons is that because they are not owned by any particular entity, individual, or group, they tend to be overexploited. The scholar Garrett James Harden in 1968 wrote, "Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all." And this is actually an idea that goes back to much earlier. In 1833, William Foster Lloyd had written that the pursuit of individual gain leads to the abrogation of the common good. So I will later on explain how this ties in with the other concepts and why this is something that we need to focus on. It is key to the whole notion of maritime consciousness, which, as I said, is key to India's growth as a nation, as a global power. The second concept that I had mentioned was the concept of public goods. This is a concept that comes to us from the discipline of economics. A public good is essentially a good or service that is both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And what this means basically is that one individual can consume it without reducing its availability to any other individual. The cost of keeping non-payers from enjoying the benefits is prohibitive. So essentially, it's a good where there is what is called the free rider problem, namely valuable goods and services that people otherwise would be willing to pay for and consume remain fundamentally unproduced. A good whose consumption is not decided by individual consumers, but by society as a whole, and which is therefore financed by taxation. Now, this is kind of, in summary, the concept of the public good. But if you were to think of examples, the best example, in fact, the quintessential public good is the road, the public road. The road is built at great expense. Everybody can use the road. Everybody benefits from the road. But who pays the cost for building the road? Who pays the cost for maintaining the road? And it's actually extremely expensive to prevent anybody from using a road. So, unless you have exit and entry barriers, toll booths, etc., a road is open to everybody. Another example, an example from our times, is the internet. The internet is another classic example of a public good. It exists. So there's a system, a web of satellites, a web of computer nodes, and communication systems. Everybody can benefit from the internet, but the question of who pays remains. But again, from our point of view, thinking about the domain that we are interested in, the public good that is most important for us are what are called the sea lanes of communication. The sea lines of communication, or the SLOCs, are those pathways on the seas on which global commerce travels. How do you keep the SLOCs safe? How do you keep life at sea safe? How do you prevent pollution at sea? These are all key questions relating to public good. And this particular public good is absolutely central to the maritime domain. The third concept that I think we need to sort of bring in here is the concept of sovereign territoriality. Now, this idea comes from a series of 3 treaties that were signed in Europe between 1648, in 1648. And what these treaties did, what is called the Peace of Westphalia, essentially brought the 30 years war to an end, and also the 80 years war between Spain and the Dutch Republic to an end. But we don't need to focus on the history of it. The historical consequences of 1648 are what we need to focus on, because the historical consequences of 1648 were the creation of a sovereign state system. So this system is not just sovereign, it is territorial. This is a very key point that must be remembered. The Westphalian system, as it is called, is a state system. It's a system which consists solely of states and of their mutual interaction. There is no authority above or over the sovereign state. The sovereign state system gives each state enormous power, but also huge vulnerabilities. A sovereign state has only itself to be responsible to, but it also has only itself to fall back on. A direct implication of this is that each state has to guarantee its own security. That, in fact, becomes a primary responsibility of a state. And in that sense, it's very important to remember, and this is relevant in the context of the maritime domain, the Westphalian system is a war system. And out here, the key point to keep in mind is this: as technology opens up new spaces, those spaces, in effect, get territorialized. A classic example of this is the columns of air above land and sea. When human beings couldn't actually move in the air columns, it was actually considered to be free domain. But once heavier than air technology came at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the early 20th century, very soon the air columns became territorialized. Today, as we know, when we think about sovereign territory, we also think about the airspace. Countries control the airspace over their territory. So the internet is emerging as another such area. So far, we think of the internet as being free of sovereign control. But this new space that has been created called cyberspace is also likely over time in precisely the same way to be territorialized. I won't say more about this, but it's a very, very important thought for us to keep in mind as we think about India in 2047. The fourth concept that I wanted to bring in to tie this all together is a concept that has come to us from critical geopolitics. And that is the concept of space and place. Now, I need to explain this a bit. Place is really defined as a particular part of space that can be occupied or unoccupied, real or perceived. What does this mean? Space is empty. Space is defined as that which is occupied by an object's volume, namely x, y, z, in some ways, 3 dimensions. That is what space is. Coordinates. That is what space is. A space has coordinates. A place has meaning. That's a fundamental distinction. A concrete sense of place emerges out of the specific meanings that individual human beings and social collectivities ascribe to empty, abstract space. So space by itself is just X, Y, Z. It is empty and it is abstract. It is when you give some meaning to that, when there's a concrete sense of place. One classic example, one person's desolate desert is another person's homeland. So I may look and see a barren land and say, oh, but for somebody else, that may be home for them. So we have to understand the distinction between space and place. Geography is not just about space. Geography is also about place. And our species, this is the question of our basic biology. As a species, the human being, Homo sapiens, we are a species that is terrestrial. We live on land. We are not amphibious. We do not live on land and water. We are certainly not, a waterborne species. We are wingless as well, which means we can't fly by ourselves. We need machines in order to fly. The point, therefore, is that for most human beings, the open seas are seen as a space that does not have any significance, bereft of any significance. The only human beings who see the seas not as a space but as a place are those who make their livelihood on the seas. So the sailors and seafarers, our fishing communities, our navy, they are the only people who actually have a sense of place about the sea. And a sense of place, as we have seen, is extremely important. I'm thinking about the poem Sea Fever by John Masefield, beautiful lines. I must down to the sea again, to the lonely sea and sky. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. A little later on, it says, I must down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. Now, this sense about the seas being a place is a sense that very few individual human beings have. And I think one of the key challenges, therefore, going forward, is to give that sense of what the seas are, the significance of the seas, to the wider population. If we don't do that, we will continue to be a society which fundamentally lacks a maritime consciousness. I'm speaking from Goa, and this is a part of our country which has always been tied to the seas. We are an Indian Ocean people. But even in Goa, a place like Goa, I don't think that we could say that there is maritime consciousness in all aspects of society, in all parts of society. And that, therefore, as I see it, think about India in 2047 is a key challenge. So to sum up what I'm trying to say, therefore, the maritime domain, first of all, is a global commons. What this means is that it is unowned. Hence, it is liable to overexploitation. And we are seeing this with all the fish stocks around the world now. Fishes are disappearing at a shocking, alarming rate. And one of the reasons is because they are a global commons. Secondly, thinking about the maritime domain, it's a public good, used by all. But the question remains, who's paying for it, paid for by whom? The third concept, as I said, is sovereign territoriality. And here the key point to remember is that states aspire to control it, subject to techno capability. So to the extent that you have the technological capability as a state to control a space, you will territorialize it and you will control it. And a key question for countries that are like India, that now have a global profile and which are keen on maintaining their global profile is to understand this key aspect. And finally, the distinction between space and place. This maritime domain lacking significance for most people, but if we are to increase maritime consciousness in our society, I believe, and I would suggest to all of you, that we need to make the seas, the high seas in particular, a place. And that is, I think, in some ways a key challenge. I'd like to just end with another final thought, and that is this. Naval strategists now, contemporary naval strategists, are also sort of re-examining the notion of sea power itself. And a final thought that I would like to leave you all with is this, that sea power is not just power at sea. Genuine sea power is power derived from the sea. To the extent that which we as a country can become stronger, wealthier, based on the resources of the sea, in other words, derive our power from the sea, the better it will be for the maritime domain in terms of our society, but also for our country as a whole as it finds its rightful place in the world. Thank you very much again for this kind invitation. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Professor Varun Sani. I will begin with one of your last lines, just that power, sea power is not just power of the sea, but power derived from the sea. And that's an amazing summary of your entire thesis on maritime domain and consciousness. So that is the correct focus of the validity session to wrap up this entire theme on Navy and nation building. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. We are at the last lap of a symposium. I have the privilege now to invite the Vice Chairman, Maritime History Society, and the Flag Officer Commanding Maharashtra Naval Area, Rear Admiral Atul Anand, Vishisht Seva Medal, to deliver the vote of thanks. Admiral, the screen is yours.
Honorable Rajya Raksha Mantri, Shri Ajay Bhatt, Admiral Karambir Singh, Chief of the Naval Staff, Vice Admiral R. Hari Kumar, Flag Officer Commanding in Chief, Western Naval Command, distinguished moderators and speakers, enthusiasts across maritime India, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we have had the honor of conducting the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav as a national celebration by the Indian Navy. The rich deliberations we have witnessed are a fitting tribute to India's maritime vision. It is an honor and a privilege for me to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Western Naval Command and Maharashtra Naval Area for this commemorative digital symposium. The various eminent speakers from both academia and the Navy covered the themes of a maritime legacy and loss of freedom at sea, naval contribution to the freedom struggle, as well as Indian Navy and 75 years of nation building. A short film also helped showcase the bravery of the young Indian sailors and their role in the struggle for India's independence. We have just heard powerful and thought-provoking academic nuggets. A special and sincere expression of thanks to all the moderators and speakers for your rich and hugely valuable contribution to this flagship endeavor of the Indian Navy, which was conducted by the Maritime History Society. I take this opportunity to express our special and sincere thanks to Shri Ajay Bhatt, the Honorable Rajya Raksha Mantri, for gracing this occasion as the chief guest. His presence today has immensely enhanced the function's prestige and importance. We are extremely grateful to you, sir, for your keynote address and for releasing the English translation of the Kutchi Navigational Diaries of Boatmen, Malam Ni Pothi, Volume 1. It would be remiss of me not to express our special thanks to the Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Karambir Singh, and the Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Vice Admiral R. Hari Kumar, who had so readily consented for the idea of this event and who have provided visionary guidance and more than the requisite support for its successful conduct. I would also like to thank the Chief of the Naval Staff for the insightful address and the Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Western Naval Command, for the welcome address. I would also like to place on record my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Varun Sani for delivering the valedictory address. I would like to make a special and laudatory mention of the sterling efforts put in by Captain K-22 and his team for producing a movie which provided an interesting insight into the 1946 naval uprising. Lastly, my thanks are due to the Director, Maritime History Society and his incredibly efficient operations team who have worked tirelessly to make this program a success. Thank you all. We look forward to more such fruitful interactions. Jai Hind and Shah No Varuna.
Thank you, Admiral. That is extremely encouraging. But ladies and gentlemen, we are not done. The millennia-long spread of India's maritime legacy defined a timeless wake when young Indians, naval officers and ratings, having tasted success in World War II, led a transformation into an emerging Indian Navy of substance. Today's symposium has reflected upon the fact that Indian Navy has certainly continued to sustain this journey of empowering India. Cherishing the 75 years of freedom and the sacrifices of our valiant freedom fighters who stood up against the colonialists, we would move towards closing the symposium. Before we depart, I think the best tribute at the close is to listen to a musical rendition which was originally composed as a tribute to the Malams, put together musically by David Century, sung by Riddhi Joshi, with sketches by Prathamesh Sawant and penned at the Maritime History Society. But as we watch it, we celebrate what India celebrated last week, the first sailing of indigenous aircraft carrier 1, the future INS Vikrant. Thereafter, the song will continue, a song called Sagara. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind, Samna Varun. This is a musical finale.